Welcome back for this afternoon. For those of you in the cheap seats, I hope you're most welcome to come and sit over here. I hope you can see if you sit over there. There will be some PowerPoints and some discussion with the mics. My name is Heather Hudson. I guess I represent the frontier and somewhere outside the land of fiber to the home and some of the things you've heard about. I'm still affiliated with the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And taking the prerogative of the chair, I will tell you I have a new book out called Connecting Alaskans about communication in Alaska, and I'm happy to tell you about it at the break. It deals with some of the challenges serving remote and northern regions. But our panel today is going to look at some of the policy and regulatory issues that surround some of the technological and content challenges and innovations we heard about this morning. And I was thinking when I arrived, Ellie was talking about maybe over-the-top regulation for over-the-top services. And I thought, well, I think some people would characterize what regulators have done in the past few decades as sometimes being over-the-top anyway. So we'll see what our panelists have in mind. And we have three panelists. Matthias Kurt, who's now executive chairman of Cable Europe and is a former regulator in Germany. Chris Yu, who's at Columbia and director of the Center for Technology, Innovation and Competition at Penn. Why did I say Columbia? He's sitting here today, but he's back. And Alison Neplokh, who's the deputy chief technologist, and she can tell us what that includes at the FCC. So we're going to start with Matthias, please.
Heather, thanks for introducing me. So as you mentioned, I'm here around with CITI for more than 10 years, and now I have maybe a little bit other perspective from the cable industry, but I haven't forgot what I talked the years before. So I think I bring it in line with what my regulatory concepts are. Unless you correct me on that, I'm open for critique. So another thing about what I heard, I hope this part of this afternoon session might not be the boring part, because we are discussing about regulation and laws, and the fun part was in the morning where we discussed about all the new technologies which are popping up. But we all know that in the end of the day, both work streams, new technologies and regulation, have to be in line, otherwise the system doesn't function. And so we can learn, I think, in such a conference what's going on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's obviously quite interesting, because we had a lot of discussions which went to other solutions, like the net neutrality debate, where the FCC, as we all know, has decided to put it under Title II. And you know this debate better than I, which puzzles one or the others. In Europe, it's much more relaxed so far by the European Parliament and the Commission. There was a definite statement that specialized services are okay, unless you would have blocking, throttling also of the so-called open internet. So there is still a likelihood that it will be an oversight role for my successor and all the other national regulators to have an oversight about the consumer perspectives and about the quality of service. That will be very strict. But on the other hand, specialized services are not completely banned, like somebody is afraid that it's done here in the US. Another thing which you might be interested in, I might come back, is now privacy. You know, just some weeks ago, the European Court of Justice made a sentence and declared the old safe harbor agreement between Europe and the US is not fit for purpose to secure the private data of European citizens. And so everybody is now extremely nervous what will happen. And I just read this morning that there will be a deadline by the end of January where Europe and the US have to negotiate a successor agreement for safe harbor. Hopefully, under the pressure of this sentence, they will find a solution which is acceptable for both sides. And otherwise, I think companies who are exchanging data between Europe and the US are under extreme difficult situations. You know, I just mentioned over lunch that Volkswagen is now in a situation in the US where they might be fined some billions. People say 30 billions, 40 billions. And I was asked the question, do you think that regulators have a chance to intervene on an international scale? I said, yes, they have. Volkswagen now, the market value is cut to half, and so it's not that international systems or OTT mean that there is no say of national or European or US administrations or regulators. There is a threat that these things have to be fulfilled. But hopefully, I think everybody, and that's now the positive part I want to come on, everybody wants in Europe and also in the US to develop a single European digital market. Jason, I thought I push here. No, it doesn't work. Jason, it's just I need to. He explained I should push here, and then it would go to the next slide. Here I tried both, but both doesn't. Jason, sorry, I need your help a little bit. Yeah, I tried that. Okay. Yeah, we are here. So I can go next.
If you just click on the arrow there.
On the arrow. Okay, good. So this is a slide which shows that the European Commission has now put the so-called digital single market in the focus of their efforts for the next years. Because they think a digital single market could unlock, as we all know, a lot of economic potential, a lot for consumers. So they have identified work streams for 2015 and 2016. The first one is better access for consumer and business to digital goods and services across Europe. So that means also looking into e-commerce rules. Is it because we still have national silos in Europe? Europe is more diverse than the US is. We have different national regulations. So the European Union tries to harmonize contract rules. There is also a discussion, I wonder if you're aware, about geo-blocking. We had a question this morning already on geo-blocking. Europe had a commissioner, Ansip. He said, I hate geo-blocking, So that was his statement, Then it was a little bit of hot potato. Then another commissioner said, I hate when the alarm clock is ringing at 5 o'clock in the morning, So the whole hate of geo-blocking is now a little bit softened down towards unjustified geo-blocking. So now the issue is, what is unjustified geo-blocking? Obviously, we had people from Turner here this morning and content holders and rights holders. Everybody is now aware that these content rights are not marketed on a European scale, especially the more and more expensive sport rights. As we all know, I don't know what you have to pay here for football. It's skyrocketing prices, So in Europe, it's not that popular. So it wouldn't make any sense to pay a lot of money in Europe for football rights, Maybe for soccer, it's the other way around, but not for football. So also somebody in Lithuania or in Latvia might not be extremely interested in the Portuguese national soccer teams. So all these rights are more and more negotiated on a national scale, and in some areas it makes sense, In other areas it might be unjustified. So that's a big topic. What is justified? What is unjustified? But obviously consumers hate it. By the way, the cable industry developed another topic it called portability. So if it's something different than abolishing geo-blocking, because the idea would be if you have paid for content to your supplier in your home country, like I had paid in Germany, maybe to my supplier, and I moved to Brussels, which I do quite often, so I should be able to access with my device in a system which is transparent, my content in Germany, which I had paid for, So it's a different solution. We call it portability and not geo-blocking. But we will see it's a lot of hot potatoes, and everybody who is into the content business is extremely nervous that the same thing will happen like in international roaming, because we had for years a fight against international roaming fees. Everybody in Europe thought it's completely unjustified that it's a rip-off if you have to pay roaming fees in a neighboring country, which are skyrocketing. So everybody thinks, okay, with geo-blocking, it could end up in a similar thing. Okay, regulation on consumer protection will be on the topic But sometimes, like here, some things are also blocking an internal market, like parcel delivery costs, which is not a telco subject. But I myself identified if you buy something in the UK, a physical product, and it has to be delivered to Germany, it sometimes gets double the costs. You have to pay double just for $20, $30, $40 for shipping. And people think that's not justified, that there is a kind of a fine on shipping. So they will look into these kind of things. An interesting topic, and as Eli, we discussed yesterday about it, is the VAT regimes. There is also already a work stream to say, okay, legislative proposals to reduce the administrative burden on business arising from different VAT regimes, which is also different in some areas. So, and we know the VAT discussion is also hot. Okay, that's all want to create better access for consumers, better business, and the Commission thinks that they can unlock some billions if we get that right, because if we make it easier. So, the second point is creating the right conditions for digital networks and services to flourish. In 2015, there is already, and there are some studies out, an analysis of the role of platforms in the market, including illegal content on the internet. This is more the analytical part, and that will lead then in 2016 to legislative proposal to reform the current telecom rules. That means directly not only maybe a refit of the 2009 telecom framework in Europe, but maybe a completely change of this telecom framework under the rules for a convergent situation which had not been there in 2009. The argument is the situation has changed a lot in the past 10 years. We need now a framework for the next 10 or next 15 years, and not one who is backwards looking like the Title II regulation was done in the US in a completely different time. And that means not only changing the telecom rules, but also looking in the Audiovisual Media Service Directive. Someone who is familiar with that was it started with a Television Without Frontiers, and then it went to the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, which is separate from the telco rules. So we have different regulations for different services who are more and more converging. Then there's also a review of the e-privacy directive. I already mentioned it's now a hot potato, and the establishment of cybersecurity and other measures. So that's what we are more in the focus, what we are discussing now in this panel. And obviously the third point is that there is a maximizing the growth and the potential of the digital economy. And there's an e-government plan, how to get the take-up of digital services right, and a free flow of data, initiatives on data ownership. We all know that this is also not only the privacy, but how do you, big data, how is big data now a topic for source of income, not only remuneration, what you get from your customer, but some services seem to be free, but you are paying more or less with your data, how is this embedded in the system? Good. So I try to get on. So if you dig a little bit deeper to the existing structures, what are the essential elements of the definitions of the existing structures? So I just want to cite something, what is an electronic communication service that might be, that's in the left corner above, where you see there are some elements. The whole definition is electronic communication service means a service normally provided for remuneration, difficult word, which consists wholly or mainly in the conveyance of signals on electronic communication networks, including telecommunication services and transmission services in networks used for broadcasting, but exclude services providing or exercising editorial control over content transmitted using electronic communication networks and services. It does not include information society service, which do not consist wholly or mainly in the conveyance of signals on electronic communication networks. Very complicated, yeah? Even the lawyers here in this room might not be immediately able to detect what it means. And it was done in a situation where we don't have the OTT service, to be honest. But you say wholly or mainly signals, everybody thinks, is this now the right border to define different sets of regulation? In the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, there is the expression editorial control. Do these intermediary services have editorial control? Yes, or do they just put through what users and others are generating? They have no control that puts it on that. And the other is information society services. They are done at a distance by electronic means and at the individual request of a recipient of the service. Good. You see that these elements might be tricky to redefine, but what's even more tricky is what are the consequences of that? Electronic, that's again television on demand. The Audiovisual Media Service Directive, by the way, it was a different regulation for linear services and on-demand services. So if you have a linear service, you had a higher level of regulation and of obligation because the original idea was in a linear service, you don't have choice here. You have to take what's coming linear. But if you have a pull service, video on demand or on-demand service, the consumer already has a kind of a choice what he wants, so he is not the target of the broadcaster. So therefore they had different, but imagine in the environment we are living in, where we have time shift, where we had a lot of more things popping up, this seems to me a little bit old-fashioned to have this border for different forms of regulation. And okay, go on. But the main structure of the whole discussion is that the classical ECS service are regulated by the telco package, very highly regulated, very strict regulation, a lot of obligations, a lot of even price controls, market analysis, a very deep digging system, a little bit like the Title II system here in the States, but maybe not as old-fashioned, but going in this direction. So the Audiovisual Media Service Directive was different and was much more lighter-handed and has much less obligations than the electronic communication services. And the information society services, which are basically the internet services, they are very light-handed regulated. There is only a service directive who is regulating the OTT. And now the main discussion in Europe is that fair? Is this a fair proposal? Everybody discuss now, we need a level playing field. What is a level playing field? Between services who are similar. I give you an example. Everybody knows WhatsApp. And when I was a regulator, we regulated the SMS tariffs because we thought SMS tariffs should be cost-orientated. And some of the costs for SMS services, that are sometimes only very few. It's a bypass service to the voice service, But a lot of operators ask a lot of money for SMS. So it was price regulated, there were cost orientation, other things. Then WhatsApp came, and nowadays, to be honest, I admit I use more WhatsApp than I used SMS, because you can send here from New York, you can send pics to your friends, you make a photograph from Colombia, it's immediately there. I can't do that with SMS. So what happened is WhatsApp has eaten up all the profits which came out of SMS from the traditional operators. So people say, okay, and WhatsApp is not regulated at all because it's on the lower part of this triangle, not being regulated, but taking away all the profits. So the operators from the classical service come, why are we price regulated? And another service who is better, who is directly competing with us, is now not regulated at all, has no obligations, no universal service, nothing. So it comes to this point to say, what do you have to change? I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the rules of electronic communication service are put on the OTT services. It could be also the other way around, that you could come up with a proposal to say, okay, there is now a competition between OTT and classical services, so we need no longer to regulate it because they are losing their revenues anyhow because people are going over. So there is a competition, but this has to be defined, it has to be discussed. Yeah. So I'm not sure, that's one example. Another example is Skype. If you look on Skype, it's a voice service. There is a Skype service which is also have a bridge to the classical PSTN. You can call in. So, but for emergency calls, for example, the classical telephone system has a lot of obligations to route the traffic in an emergency case to a specific hospital which is close. That's not the case with Skype. It's even not. Some say it's even not possible. So operators come up and say, why do we have, if there's a voice service, why do we have different sets of obligations? So that's a problem. I can't tell you no solution yet, but here you see the regulatory consequences, which have to be reflected and discussed. Right now, there is a public consultation. You can see 10 pages. The European Commission issued 110 pages only with questions, you know. That's something a lot of studies, they issued studies, questions, you know, that's how they do it. So they haven't indicated what they want to do, but they put all the possible questions you could have around to the stakeholders, to the general public, to critics, and so we are in an early phase, but the issue which is here, ECS is still a national authorization. There are special rules on privacy, special rules on consumer protection, special rules for access of third party to network. Competitors have network access. ISPs, that's basically the ISPs, Vodafone, the infrastructure carrier, the telco carrier. In the audiovisual media service, so far you have the country of origin. Maybe I should mention that a little bit, what that means. That makes it easy, the licensing and the authorization. Because when you have a license in Ireland, which I think Google had, or Facebook, because everybody went to Ireland, because it was the lowest level of privacy laws and everything was in Ireland. So everybody went to Ireland, you know. So, but then because of the country of origin, if you are licensed for audiovisual service, a media service in Ireland, you could distribute it everywhere, you know. So especially the French hate it, but others hate it also. They don't want the country of origin, they want the principle of country of destination. So if somebody like Netflix is sending in traffic to France, they should keep the French rules. And if they are registered in Ireland, you know, that's not sufficient. So it's a hot discussion because the French have special subsidies for culture, for local and regional culture. So they want to put it also on kind of Netflix services. They say, okay, if they have now such a service which produces such a lot of content, why don't they also contribute to our national French content? Just to give you one hot potato. Then the data protection rules are softer on personal data, on consumer protections. There are rules for protecting of minors. There are rules on quotas, on advertising, on fairness. But that's not for everybody, you know, because these rules are also sometimes for the classical broadcasters, but not for the Netflix kind of service. Yeah, and so you see Netflix over-the-top services and television on demand is also in the challenging discussion. Also, the question is linear and non-linear? Is it a discussion which makes sense, or do we have to have a different new definition? And last point, Heather, the information society services, which are light-handed regulated, or no regulated, there is no authorization for all these services. Compared to the others, there is at least some kind of authorization, but here is no authorization. There are no information requirements. Even the regulators don't know, for example, how many customers WhatsApp has. Imagine, you know, we would do a market analysis and would put WhatsApp in the same market like SMS. My successor couldn't write to WhatsApp, how many customers do you have in Germany? How is your, because it's not in the focus of regulation. So that's, even if the service is there is no information possibility. And the general rules on data protection are also there. But the issue is then, which service is, which OTT service is closer to electronic communication, Skype service kind of type, which service is closer to information society service. And I'm coming to the end. And this is a debate, I mentioned it, which is pending. And so I think this discussion here might help to find the European Union a solution. And hopefully we will find solutions which are also fit for the US, because we know the internet is an international thing, and we should keep the charm of being international. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. So now we know there are 3 categories to worry about. Our next speaker is Chris Yu from the University of Pennsylvania. Chris.
Oh, thank you. And do you mind if I speak from here? Is that all right, Heather?
Whatever works for you. I think as long as we speak into the mic for our audience in wherever.
Well, thank you. So the only thing I will say in correction about the recommendation, I'm attempting to make a change. Actually, I'm trying to go by Christopher, because my wife is named Chris, and I married into it. She's just Chris, not Kristen or Christina. So I'm attempting to make this change. People who knew me before will find it difficult, but it is something I'm attempting to do. So I actually had put together some slides which Pepper thoughtfully made unnecessary and redundant. So I decided not to do them. One of the things that's very interesting to me is the number of the patterns and the trends that are really transforming what's going on in the industry. Some of the things that Pepper highlighted. MVPD has been in decline since 2013. At this point, it's a fairly slow decline. But as some people say, when it goes fast. I mean, it's hard for us to predict what's exactly going to happen. OTT is growing linearly, straight up. It's not just in the US, which is just now showing some slight inflection point of slowing down, but globally as providers like Netflix roll out country after country and they're projected to grow in the billions. It's pretty shocking about what the upward potential is, and we don't really know where that is going to plateau. We see a shift from fixed to mobile. What we see is a new generation of people who wish to see content when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, and are insisting on it. And what's interesting is I think that we all have a certain myopia. One of the slides I would show you is this huge difference in attitudes based on age about the willing to utilize these things. If any of you have teenage children, I will tell you right now, the voice feature on the phone is a useless feature to him. The only person he calls is me and other similar fossils who insist on these sorts of things. But not only that, I remember when they came out and I said, who is going to watch video on a screen this size? And the answer is apparently everybody. And for all of us who thought we're so smart, we're in this industry, we analyze, we understand this better. You all bought Netflix in 2011 when their market cap dropped from 14 bill down to what, 1 to 2 bill? And you're now enjoying your 24 to what, 25 to 30 billion dollar market capitalization rise? And we all got out of Cisco before it tanked, right? I mean, it's just one of those things where it's just a tough business to be in. And we have these people say with great confidence, for example, that fixed mobile substitution will never happen and video will be the great break. The last data I saw said that 11% of US households are wireless-only broadband households. And the country one of the biggest moments happened in Europe is in Austria, it's 24% fixed mobile substitution, and the regulator approved putting them in the same product category for regulatory purposes because there was enough substitution between the two. People say, how are we going to get the spectrum? What's the pricing? I'm always reminded of Metro PCS's initial foray into LTE on 1.4 megahertz of spectrum with old 1G spectrum, basically by taking the resolution out of video. Because when you're delivering it to a handheld device, HDTV doesn't carry the same benefits. And so they were able to compress it. We see a trend that has not been highlighted at this point is a shift of online activity from advertising supported to subscription supported. This is a big change. I mean, one of the interesting features is people have been unwilling to pay for content. Actually, what's interesting, even the New York Times has finally moved the needle on being able to get access to their online stuff. But in the video world, it seems to be understood that we will pay for that content to an extent which didn't exist before. One of the papers I'm writing right now, by the way, is to recover the lost history of broadcast scholarship that criticized advertising support because of the flaws it induced in terms of actually reproducing their real preferences in terms of revenue. And that's something that I think has been lost to history. The other thing I see is a dramatic drop in production costs. The comment was made earlier about how cameras have changed. It's not just cameras. Editing has changed dramatically. Editing, where you had to physically cut media and used to have in one way and then encode it digitally. Now it's all done digitally, and editing has become so cheap that you can actually create very, very high quality production value things for a it's the golden age of television from the production standpoint. There's never been more video produced. And even regardless of how you classify it, whether it's the funded linear stuff or the amateur user-generated content that's being developed, it's just simply astonishing. The other thing that also strikes me in terms of trends is the number of experiments that are going on that people said would never happen. Skinny bundles are happening. Verizon has shifted its business model to a stripped-down bundle where you can then add for $10 a month a sports package of 5 channels, and you basically grow your bundle from there. That's something many people predicted would never happen, and it's happening. You start to see, obviously, all the major networks have shifted to online distribution same day of their primetime content. ABC and NBC did it within the original model by insisting that you demonstrate that you had an MVPD connection. CBS, for the first time this year, started doing it on a subscription basis, which is a major move for them. You see ESPN going to internet-based distribution through the Dish Sling TV product. Again, this is, I think, what you're starting to see is a great deal of experimentation of different business models to find out exactly what is going to happen, because they're worried that if the world shifts and they make no experimentation on that side, that they may be left without anything, without any access to a customer base that's run away from them. And the other thing that's fascinating to me is one of the huge pressures right now. They just announced on September 30th that CBS is going to start including its online viewership in its Nielsen ratings and its reported ratings. And this is a change that probably is welcome in a certain sense, because we all know there's an enormous amount of video content. I cannot remember the last time my children turned on a linear television program. They just don't do it. And it's not that they're not watching video, they're watching plenty of it. They're just getting it a different way, and they are consuming some content that is done that way. And so we're seeing some big changes. So what's interesting to me is in these changes, you see a lot of companies attempting to change their business models to try to survive, but the experienced ones that are that are used to dealing with regulators are attempting to use the regulatory system to their advantage. And particularly if they have a long-standing lobbying office in DC, they're attempting to use their connections there to disadvantage, say, some newcomers who don't have that tradition. And so without naming particular companies, I find that some people in the video world, they want to get part of the regulatory system that benefits them, but avoid the rest of the regulatory system that would hurt them. So they want access to the program access rules without picking up the full MVPD obligations. They want access to the poll attachment rules without picking up the full range of MVPD obligations. And what strikes me is this is a classic case where a regulator runs the risk of taking steps that benefit competitors, not consumers. And that, in fact, you understand why this is good for individual companies' business models. But I think that a regulator has to turn back to fundamentals and think about why we had these regulatory programs to begin with, and to try to figure out what an appropriate financing mechanism and implementation mechanism is. So actually, it's sort of interesting, one of the examples that Matthias points out. One of the reasons we regulated SMS is because we were worried about the exercise of market power and pricing. Now, there's a problem with cost recovery, and there's a tendency to view SMS as free because it's a voice network. Well, as I said to my son, it's an SMS network, and the free rider is voice. So actually allocating costs to the different services changes the way you look at them. And on some level, trying to define that is quite tricky. But the reality is, once you have this huge array of online over-the-top services, which are not equivalent, they're better. They're less efficient in spectrum, by the way. That is one thing that they are worse at, because a single-purpose app can be better at conserving on bandwidth, because it doesn't have to carry the overhead for flexibility. But in this world, the idea that anyone would be paying exorbitant fees for what is equivalent of a text message, whether it's done through the telecom network or over the top through an IP-based network, the compelling need for economic regulation has disappeared. And in fact, there may be other justifications that we can talk about regulating in terms of universal text to 911 and other things that we might have to worry about. But the traditional rate regulation justification just seems to be ready for revision. One of the fascinating things we're seeing is the Paris prosecutor has referred Skype to the Paris regulator has referred Skype to the Paris prosecutor for criminal prosecution for Skype's refusal to register as a traditional ECS. And they are saying, we're not a facilities-based provider, we're not pretending to do that, and there are some 911 issues that may get worked out, but the reality is they're putting them up for criminal liability right now, because we're taking this old world, and in fact, new technologies are extremely disruptive to old regulatory regimes which have cross-subsidies built into them to make them go. This very much reminds me of when we had a railroad monopoly, we built an interstate system, then we got a trucking industry that was a viable competitor to trains for the first time. This should be a wonderful policy moment. We should be celebrating. The regulator's reaction is these trucks are screwing up the beautiful regulatory regime we've created for trains. It's creating all the things, the social policies we've embedded in them. We're going to lose service to these small places. We're going to fold trucks and buses into the same regulatory regime, even though they're not natural monopolies. And that's the problem, is that if we go to the complaints and we don't look back to the fundamentals, we risk losing a great deal. So the other thing I would say is, on a much broader level, thinking about the moments of media policy, if you go back to the first big issue in media policy in the 1940s was the fact that we only had 3 broadcast networks, then in radio. And we have solved that problem in spades. I mean, we now have hundreds of video networks in ways that are dramatic. Second problem we had, monopoly provision of multi-channel video, only by the cable operator. We've solved that problem. We solved the monopoly problem in voice in spades to the point where no one seems to have a landline phone anymore. Now think back to the big issues we talked about in video distribution. For 20 years, we fought over must carry. And then in the early 2000s, we fought over the media ownership rules, whether a newspaper could own a broadcast station or vice versa. It all seems so quaint now, doesn't it? I mean, it's really kind of striking to me how just taking rules and things that were developed for different contexts without understanding how far we've come and what the opportunities are created risks a great deal. That isn't to say that there weren't legitimate policies underlying some of those other issues. For example, to the extent to which program access remains an issue, the things I'm talking about haven't necessarily revolutionized certain forms of content, but on the other hand, maybe the drop in production costs have. We do need to sit back and think about it in the new context to see what we can figure out, to see from the bottom up, to see what makes sense. Now that's sort of in my opinion, the easy part of what any decent policy analyst would do, which is you look at the new technology, look at the new industrial organization, figure out what opportunities it gives you. I want to complicate the video space a little bit more, which is we talk about this as a regulatory matter. Video regulation is deeply linked to other regulatory regimes, particularly copyright. As we all know, the whole negotiations of carriage of cable video is deeply affected by not only the must-carry rules, but the compulsory license implied in copyright law. And in fact, that was created for a given dynamic that existed in the day. The idea of must carry that some broadcaster would have to force its way onto a channel seems quaint in a day where basically every negotiation has the money flowing the other direction. Set that to one side. What you're going to see is the jurisdiction to solve this problem is going to go beyond what a communications regulator can reach. It gets even worse in Europe. Europe has the problem of the digital single market is a wonderful initiative that should be applauded. It will require the coordination of more DGs than the typical regulation will require, and is going to, in a world where each has a national leader of the different kind, it gets embedded in a very strange set of politics. You also do this in a world that Matthias hinted at, where in the content space, nation states are given greater latitude to impose national law and deviate from European law in order to preserve content subsidies. And so what we're going to see there is a very elaborate example of how copyright kicks in, but it gets even worse. The state-owned broadcasters, they are alive and well in Europe. And what you'll discover is broadcasting is not declining in Europe. And we have a tendency to generalize from that fact here, and that's just not the case. In Germany, for example, there are not only federal state-owned broadcasters, there are Länder state-owned broadcasters, including one who I met with was just Medienanstalt Berlin-Brandenburg, which is the one that regulates Berlin. And their reaction to the potential entry of Netflix is said, we can do that. And they essentially stalled the entry of Netflix by several years in an attempt and a waste of significant expense to try to develop their own media distribution platform in a way that didn't make a lot of sense and ultimately failed. And so what you start to see is that second, as Milo had pointed out, being able to charge for linear video is an essential part of any fiber build. And so there is a deep interaction between the ability to capture that. What you have in Europe is a world in which you have levies on television sets, which are then redirected to state-owned broadcasters in ways that limit your ability to make money. And digital DBS channels, the basic channels, are generally free. So if you buy the equipment, you can get basic service without having to pay any subscription fee to the person providing it. And that affects not only the DBS environment, but it is a competitive limitation on any would-be fiber builder who needs video to pay it out. And so what you're discovering is that, in fact, this is not just a matter of regulation. It's deeply linked to the overall structure of the industry. And that, in fact, what you see is that these state-owned broadcasters are quite powerful and influential in the political processes in ways that we don't understand, don't experience in the same way here. And another thing I will note that both Orange, ex-France Telecom, DT, and TeliaSonera are at least 1/3 owned by a government. And that creates a different set of dynamics when negotiating with them. You hear people in these companies say, the government called today. And if and the presumption is whatever they said, they'll do it. If a US carrier said, you told your boss, the government called today, it's like, yeah, well, what did they want? It's just a very different relationship, and that's true not just that in Europe, but also in Japan and many other countries. So when we try to unravel this thing, what the frustration that Netflix has when they've entered in Europe, it's not entering a single market, it's 28 countries at a time, each with their own very idiosyncratic politics and deeply embedded media institutions in ways that we know are extremely political. And that's causing an enormous amount of problems. And I would say that lurking beneath all of this is the addition of an interconnection obligation under the 2015 Open Internet Order. One of the interesting things is people say we've been talking about network neutrality a long time. I realize I bear some responsibility for that. I actually wrote the second article on network neutrality. Tim Wu wrote it in 2003. I was invited to write a response, to which he wrote a rebuttal in 2004. So I guess I bear some responsibility for starting this fight. I abjure any responsibility for keeping it going as long as it has. But there are aspects of it that feel very familiar. Interconnection is not one. Interconnection was introduced into this debate from scratch in 2014. And it is not something we understand easily well. And what's striking to me is if you have 40,000 networks interconnecting by arm's length bilateral negotiations, and we're going to start regulating certain prices, and you get one price too low, you're going to have a flow of content to that. The natural mechanism is for prices to rise and to re-equilibrate them. If you can't do that, not going to work. If you set the prices too high, you get a similar problem. But what really strike me is the presentation, both by Pepper and Milo, is the growth of CDNs and the substitution for storage for networking. And it could be storage in TiVo. You could double the the video you get by downloading to a storage device overnight while you're asleep. And we see all these alternative solutions. We should think of those as endogenous. In fact, when you're a video distributor, it's not as if you're facing a network provider and have to adjust to that negotiation. You have, for example, the typical Comcast reportedly, has 50 peering relationships and 8,000 transit relationships.
Okay, we need you to...
All right, so that's very complex. Then you always have the choice to buy a CDN and a direct connection. And if you understand the real economic decision they face ex ante, it's not, what do I do with this negotiation? It's the full run of choices. And until we start to understand and bring that in, it's going to be hard to do. So the only thing that I would say is I'm very nervous about arguments such as fairness, because it takes the status quo as given and attempts to find a way of whether we're going to level up or level down. I think that's not the right way to approach the answer. We should approach it on fundamentals. What social policies are we trying to achieve? Which ones are still valid? Which ones are still necessary for government intervention? But the most important thing I'd say is we should be humble enough at this point not to have a particular network vision embedded in the regulatory policy, because we've been proven wrong so many times on all different directions. The best world we can live in is to allow a world in which different companies can experiment with different approaches. Give regulators the tools to remediate consumer harms when they arise, but not cut off entire realms of possibilities because of worries about what might happen, because in the process, frankly, we're just not that smart. And I don't mean to hold any one person responsible, but just in general, the experts and the regulators, no matter how well-intentioned, can't possibly have anticipated the world we live in today. And I just want to make sure that we leave the flexibility to let those different worlds occur if they might.
Okay, we have 3 different models. We have infinite models. We're not that smart. Thank you, Christopher. And now over to Alison Neplokh from the FCC.
All right. Thanks. I'm sure that I anticipated whatever it is that you think we didn't
Oh, I'm sure
anticipate.
you did. You're the exception.
I'm the exception to the rule. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we regulate in an evolving marketplace, a little peek into how the sausage is made at an agency like the FCC. So I should definitely start with the disclaimer, which is any opinions I express are mine and not necessarily those of any commissioner or the chairman of the FCC. So that off the table, I'm actually going to try to stick more or less to things that are factual and descriptive and outside of the realm of opinion. And then I'm going to deviate from that. So thank you for running long, because you're going to keep me out of trouble. So
Okay, you have as much time as they do.
okay, darn. So
You have 20 minutes if you need it.
yeah, okay. So the first thing you have to do in an evolving marketplace like this is to figure out what's going on, to actually get your crystal ball, polish it off, and see what's going on. And given the time frame of regulation, you have to do that fairly early if you actually want to have regulation that has any kind of a meaningful impact. And that sounds hard, and it's even harder than it sounds. So one of the problems is, as an engineer, I tend to either have a very, very excited reaction to something. Oh my God, this is going to change the world. This is great. I had that with a little company called Sesame in 2007. They had this idea of combining over-the-top streams of content along with over-the-air streams of content and bringing them together in one box. They were going to sell this box. It was going to do a lot of preloading of content. It was going to get some stuff, immediately on demand. It was going to it was going to be great, and it was going to change the way we get content. They folded without, I think, ever actually making real revenue, and we see some hints of that today of their model has crept into current companies, but that company themselves, complete failure, and it was not for a lack of funding or trying. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that comes up, and I think that's not new. I was doing that in my dorm room in 1997, and yet then we have Netflix being the largest content provider in the world. It's as an engineer, I'm not always that great at figuring out what's going on. And lawyers really tend to not be much better than that, and I'm also a lawyer, but I mostly play engineer. To lawyers, everything is either boring, it's techie, it's geeky, I don't really care about this, or it's scary. Oh my God, this is going to destroy everything. So we as an agency often don't really have our crystal ball that much in focus. But once we've actually spotted a trend and we know that something's happening, over-the-top video is coming, we should probably make sure that we're doing what's right. Then we have to decide, do we want to act now or do we want to wait? And that's always fraught with peril, because if we wait too long, then the companies that might benefit from regulation or the companies that might seek to squash the competition have all of the time that they need to either fail or succeed at squashing the competition. On the other hand, if we act too early, then we may guess wrong and move in the wrong direction. And then, of course, if we decide that we do want to do something, the question is, what should we do? But perhaps even more importantly, what can we do? And so there's a lot of us getting hamstrung by either the Communications Act and what we're allowed to do by our authority, by just the time frame we can act through things like the Administrative Procedures Act, and by just what we can do in terms of bandwidth of the agency. We only have so many employees, we only have so much effort that we can expend. So there's that. Plus, there are other agencies involved and things outside of our control. So, a lot of people would say government gets in the way and we should just never do anything at all. And then they come and ask us to do something the next day.
Yep.
So, but the real problem is innovators can't wait for the government to act or to decide what to do. They need to start innovating now. They need to get their product on the market. In an ideal world, the government can help set the conditions that allow that to happen and stay out of the way of the innovators. And that doesn't always mean not acting, but it means making sure that we've acted in a smart way. So I do want to challenge one notion that tends to get said a lot, is that the idea that a technology mandate is bad, that the government should never mandate technology. And that's true, the government does often get it wrong. But you see things like the RJ11 jack that has enabled so much competition in the phone space, right? Modems came about. All kinds of different, cordless phones came about. All of this came about because there was a standardized interface. You have IP, which wasn't really a government tech mandate in the traditional sense, but in some ways was pretty much developed by the government. And that's been the same for 40, 50 years. You know, it really hasn't changed, and we've seen so much happen on the internet because there's a single standard staying in place. And I'm going to add to this list a slightly more controversial one, which is the cable card, which I think Milo helped defend a little bit earlier today. And you know, a lot of people would call the cable card a failure. And it is true that it never quite got the level of adoption in the marketplace on retail products that people would like. But its existence has really helped keep competition going and to keep innovation happening in the space. You know, TiVo has been able to do a lot of things. A couple of other companies have been able to do a lot of things and keep that pressure on the cable companies to actually innovate on their side as well. So maybe we do want to do something. And so then the question is, what do we do? So this chairman has had this idea of four essential values. Enduring values is his term. And he has called out competition, consumer protection, public safety, and universal access. And these are all separate, and they all need to be weighed. And I think, you know, as someone pointed out, sometimes they're at odds with each other. Competition versus consumer protection. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're at odds. And trying to figure out where exactly in that spectrum we are is great. You know, to promote public safety and to promote universal access are extremely important things for us to do to make sure that everyone can, universal access includes both things like making sure you get broadband out to everybody, but also making sure that if you have a disability, if you're blind or visual or deaf, that you can actually enjoy the services that we have. And so those things can be costly and can reduce competition or reduce the economic viability of competition. On the other hand, they're also extremely important. And so within that rubric, we have taken a lot of look at a lot of different areas, including, let's see, the technology transitions in general, which is moving the phone networks from your traditional copper networks to IP, from landline to wireless, from fixed to mobile. All of these types of transitions are happening in the phone space. And we also have, in a lot of cases, the incentive auction is an example of one of these technology transitions that we've looked at. So next year, the FCC is about to do something that has never been done anywhere else in the world. And I've spent a lot of time talking to other governments about it, and they're very excited. And that's perhaps another diversion for a second, is that whenever I talk to another country about spectrum auctions at all, their main question is, how do we get some of that money? And it's actually funny because that has never been the question at the FCC. Now, part of it is we don't actually get the money, it goes to the Treasury, and so we don't care as an agency. But also, you know, we see auctions as a way of allocating the resource, not as a way of gaining revenue. And it allows us to really think about how do we actually promote the best deployment and the best use of this resource. And so that's one thing that I want to do a little bit of a, you know, patting myself on the back, but not really myself because this is other parts of the agency, but patting the FCC on the back for generally not thinking of it as a money-making opportunity. But, you know, the incentive auction is an interesting story because the need for spectrum was identified quite a while ago in 2010 in the National Broadband Plan. This idea of having an incentive auction was first publicly announced, and it did predate that by several years. And then it took a couple of years for us to get the authority from Congress to do that in the 2012 Spectrum Act. And then in 2016, we are going to have an auction. So that's actually very fast on FCC terms to get from an idea to an implementation in 6 years. But then it will be another 3 to 4 years before we actually see that spectrum rolling out. So that's pretty much 10 years from when the idea was first published to when that spectrum's actually going to be available in any kind of meaningful way, which means we had to have our crystal balls pretty well polished back in 2010. Thankfully, the spectrum needs is something that's easier to predict than some of these other trends have been. Let's see, another thing that we've had to do a little bit of predictive judgment on is net neutrality. And some may disagree whether or not we've gotten the exact right balance in the current set of regulations, whether the last ones were better, whether none are better still. But you know, that's one of those areas where we've seen the internet serve as a great platform for innovation for a really long time. And we're seeing little hints of things that might challenge and undermine that. And how do you make sure that you maintain it as a platform for innovation without getting it wrong, but without waiting too long, because on the kind of time frame that the FCC generally is able to operate on, you could have had Netflix completely killed and never been able to launch, or the next YouTube could never start. So that is something that we have to be aware of, is to make sure that we've set up the conditions right. But then I want to spend most of the rest of my time talking about two proceedings that I'm much more intimately familiar with. And the first one is the definition of multi-channel video programming distributor, which is a little bit more important and critical, I think, than the idea of just defining something sounds. And the other one is the one that I'm desperately going to try not to call the set-top box issue. So it's the competitive availability of navigation devices, or access to content. And I don't want to call it set-top boxes because set-top boxes are not necessarily what we're talking about. You know, we could be talking about a little dongle. We could be talking about something built into a television. We could be talking about a mobile phone directly accessing content without really a traditional set top to even put a box on. But first on the definition of MVPD, because I think this is one where the agency is really sitting here trying to figure out what the best thing to do is. And I'm not going to say anything about where the agency may or may not go with this proceeding, but just to lay the issues out for a minute. So the idea is that right now we're seeing more and more services that can compete with traditional MVPDs, with your traditional cable and satellite operators, being offered over the top. But we're not seeing a lot of services that wanted to be in that space actually launching. The first company that tried to change the definition of MVPD was SkyAngel. And they had been a small play satellite operator that wanted to go over the top, and they wanted access to programming. They wanted Discovery Network's programming. And they petitioned under the program access rules and said, hey, we're an MVPD. We deliver multiple channels of linear programming, and therefore we should have access to these program access rules. And the Media Bureau at the time said, you're not really delivering channels of programming. You know, go away. We'll get to you later. Then more recently, after Aereo lost their Supreme Court case and they were found not to be legally retransmitting broadcast signals, they said, well, what if we were an MVPD? Could we get access to the compulsory copyright license? And the Copyright Office said, well, you can't get the compulsory copyright license if you're not subject to the FCC rules. And they never said that they would get the compulsory license if they were subject to the FCC rules. They just said, well, we have an easy way to say no right now. So that's still an open question, what would happen. But they came to us and said, well, aren't we an MVPD? Weren't you guys wrong when you said SkyAngel's not an MVPD? And so we opened this proceeding and we said, well, multiple channels. The word channel, does that actually mean that you have to actually have a dedicated capacity, or does it just mean a channel as consumers understand the term? Channel, you have a channel number and you get a linear feed of programming. And so that's the open question. And what we've gotten a lot of criticism on is that we may be painting with too broad of a brush. And so, is that my 5 minutes? Okay. All right. So we may be painting with too broad of a brush, and we may be looping too much in. Why can't you just do an opt-in regime? And the answer is we can't. As an agency, that's not one of the levers we have. Really, the only lever that we have is this definitional issue. Do they fit into the definition of MVPD, or do they not? And if they do, then it comes with all of the benefits, but also all of the obligations of being an MVPD. And so, yes, they get program access, they get retransmission consent. Under the retransmission consent regime, which is often touted as a negative, they do actually get the benefit of the obligation of reasonable negotiation, good faith negotiation. On the other hand, they do have some burdens, some of which probably apply anyway in over-the-top space, like closed captioning and video description, some of which, however, do not. And so the question is this something that everybody who would be redefined as an MVPD would be willing to take on? SkyAngel's already said that they would, but would everybody in this boat be interested? And right now we're getting a lot of concern from the over-the-top providers saying maybe we really don't want, maybe we can live without the benefits in exchange for not getting the obligations either. So that's where that one stands, and we're still trying to figure that one out. And then the other one is this competitive availability of navigation devices, the not set-top box issue. So in the not set-top box issue, what we're looking at, and Milo was on our committee, we did a downloadable security technology advisory committee over the summer, and came up with a couple of options for how we can move forward to make sure that consumers get access to content on their devices without having to rent a piece of equipment from a cable operator in order to get access to that content. Today, they can do that through the cable card, but the cable card is limited and clunky. It does not give you access to video on demand. It costs a fair amount of money, it takes a fair amount of power, and it can't really be built into a mobile device in any kind of easy way. So the question is, can we get to something that actually realizes the goals that we originally had with the navigation device proceeding? And that one, you're seeing, once again, some of the traditional providers coming in and saying, no, things are okay the way they are. We are doing what we need to do right now. We are giving access to content. Look, some providers are doing content to Roku. Some providers are doing a large amount, if not all of their content over the top to iPads and iPhones and maybe Android devices too, if they got around to it. So the market is working, just sit back and let it go. And that's just another one of those cases where the question fundamentally comes down to, should we or shouldn't we? And that'll be another interesting one to see play out over the next couple of months. And with that, I think I can be done.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists who raised a whole variety of issues and told us that either we hadn't figured them out yet or we weren't smart enough to be able to anticipate them. So, your turn. Questions? Comments? Please go to the mic.
I'm not sure this is a question, but I wanted to point out an externality of spectrum auctions that I doubt anybody on the federal level is aware of. Turns out that company buys spectrum at the auction, they have it, they can sell it any way they want. Then the state mandates that the counties have to have spectrum for E911 emergency use, and the counties don't have the money to buy the spectrum back from the only company that owns that spectrum. And not only that, it comes bundled with the technology that company that owns the spectrum, I don't want to use the name Motorola or any other company, of course, is selling, and that may not be the correct or best technology to use for that application to begin with. So here we have a government, federal government, that's patting itself on the back for having made all this money on auctioning off spectrum, but the reality is they're just pushing down where that money comes from to the county levels, who are then having to pick up the tab for that money.
One thing I will point out on the Spectrum Act is that one of the nice side effects of the Spectrum Act is setting aside money for FirstNet, which will provide funding for public safety networks as part of the auction proceeds from the incentive auction.
In other words, the county should know about that and where to go get money to pay for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the complicated things is the D block, which is they attempted to find an innovative solution through a public-private partnership, and it didn't sell. And one of the interesting questions is, what do you do after that, is the fact that they earmarked money so they didn't have to purchase it. There's a coordination problem that happens at the state and local level, which is quite complicated. But the other part of it is we have a problem with budgets, and we see this actually in spades in defense spectrum and their inability to loosen up spectrum. One of the big problems you have in spectrum is, in fact, the incentive auction is the only auction currently scheduled. In fact, we normally have a pipeline, and we don't anymore. Mm-hmm. And unless we think we've now freed up all the spectrum we're going to need, that is a policy agenda-setting problem, which we could do to repeat what we did in 2010 and get out in front of. But one of the interesting things about I'm trying to remember where I was going with it. Anyway, I completely forgot what I was going to say.
All right. If it comes to you, we'll let you reduce it. Okay, next question. Step right up.
I'm going to do it.
I'll finish the thought. Getting old defense people off inefficient technologies and paying them off to do it is the big problem. One of the problems with the first responders and the defense people is they're using analog, archaic technologies which are not efficient in spectrum use. And as a society, we need to get them off that. The immediate problem for the first responders is that's money out of their pocket. The old equipment works fine, and there's a benefit that accrues to the entire public from more efficient use of the spectrum. And I think that what we've done with the D block, instead of re-auctioning it and actually giving them money, is a recognition of the kinds of concerns you're raising.
Better education or outreach is needed because, of course, at
We
the
could-
county level, there's no one there who knows there's money available, and they don't have the.
There's we can continue discussion of FirstNet afterwards. I was just at an advisory meeting for them, and there is a whole process, so it sounds like it's not working completely. But, next question, David. Or comment.
Couple of things, and thank you, Christopher, for some very logical presentation. Couple of things there. Vint Cerf, Dave Farber, and 200 other engineers last Thursday, put out a major petition to the FCC that said everything that's a radio, and ultimately it means everything that's a router, should have open source, maintainable firmware and software. They believe that beside it being good for all the reasons we like open source, that's absolutely necessary to be able to get security. And that's a really interesting idea. I don't know how politically possible it is, even with somebody like Vint behind it. And the other thing is I want to follow up on a question I asked Matthias 4 years ago. You got cable, which is going to be fast enough to be decent in 2/3 of Germany. You did the best job in the world, as far as I know, in getting to the last 1% to 3%. When you put it into the auction and discovered the phone companies could actually serve those people at a quarter of the cost of something like the universal service here. That leaves, and Deutsche Telekom's committed to going to 80% now with the vectoring, if they get the vectoring through and so on. That leaves about 17% of Germany, as well as most of Italy, left behind in the last century in terms of internet speeds and capabilities. And what's the smart thing to do for that, other than just handing Deutsche Telekom a pile of billions, which is what they're recommending?
Yeah, you're right. That was indeed an idea we discussed in those days, that we embedded a kind of coverage obligation inside the license, so without creating a fund. And that went on because Germany, by the way, and it was discussed as well, already auctions the 700. So it's the digital dividend too, because it was criticized this morning that in Europe they are far behind. But that it's not completely true, because this auction for 700, Robert, was already over in May. 5 billion again was the result, but the whole 700 spectrum is also handed out now with a lot of other spectrum. And my successor also kept this rule. So they even went up to 98% coverage now for LTE or LTE Advanced. By the way, the obligation I made in 2011 or 10 is already fulfilled after 2 years. So when it comes now to 98% coverage obligation for LTE or advanced LTE, that will be, in my view, also fulfilled by the mobile operators pretty soon. And the spectrum is when a lot of people are in the same time in the same cell, the download speed goes down. But the advantage of rural areas is that there are only a few people, so they could have, even with LTE, 30 megabytes. And I think it's possible. Upload. The studies show that the traffic is not symmetric, by the way. There are maybe some B2B things are symmetric, but most of the customers, the traffic gets more and more asymmetric. I wonder if Robert agrees, because it's
Cisco
about
numbers shows this.
so the whole video discussion shows that the download of videos is always growing, and the upload is not. So, okay, just let this element. So in mobile, I think we are pretty safe that we could go to larger. But still, there are what you are talking about. There are some efforts now because Germany did now in the last auction. The funny thing that the outcome of the auction, which was about 5 billion, half of that is given for rural broadband subsidies, not creating a fund yet. It's not a fund. But even that caused a lot of discussions. Who should get the money? Should the cities get it to have their own, let's say, open access network style of things, which I think would be fair if the city or public do it, because then it's neutral to competition. But the other, what you say, which is controversial, is that German Telekom, the incumbent, might get the money. So 3 players have paid in 5 billion, and one player is getting most of the money out for a fixed system, and then maybe even for a second best technology like vectoring, which even behind DOCSIS, and we agree on that DOCSIS can go up to gigabyte in a hybrid network, but vectoring will be limited, and I'm not sure if it goes up to 100. So. Yeah, but okay, it's second best. I think the DOCSIS is already at 500 and in gigabyte area, so it will be always ahead. And so even some smaller players who do fiber who are also not happy about it. So it's a fight. There are 2.7 billion on the federal level and some other billions which might be subsidies. And I hope it's only going to extreme areas, because keeping in mind that other areas have a chance on a technology neutral basis to be covered. So it only could go to areas which are extremely rural. And in my view, you also should exclude the completely last 2% should be excluded, because I think it's no way to bring a fixed line in the Alps somewhere, Therefore, we already have Nelly Kroes, by the way, announced in 2013 that we have all over Europe a satellite connection, 25% download, a 25 meg download, for reasonable, for 30 euros, and you need an antenna for 300, and so you would have a coverage for a minimal broadband already, But so it comes to the question: what is technology neutral? I think most of the money which has to go to broadband will be privately shouldered. For Germany only, there is 8 billion a year private investment in broadband rollout, and now there is a one-time 2.7 billion for subsidies. So, and it goes to 50 or 100 billion over the years, which has to be invested to upgrade the broadband. So my bet is, let's limit these subsidies. They are there now. I can't help, Let's make it a fair distribution, that not only the incumbent is getting it, maybe that the cities and the regions are deploying their own competitive neutral system. It's called a Betreiber model in German, so that the cities are doing it. And let's limit it really to these extreme areas. And the rest has to be done by competition, because I think the competitive element, which I have seen over the years, drives everybody to invest and to upgrade their networks, because otherwise you lose the customers, that you can't deploy the service. And we have seen this development by cable and by others who had invested, so the incumbents have to follow. And you are absolutely right. In 2/3 of Germany, this kind of competitive advantage is a place. So we shouldn't kill our competitive side of the market by overemphasizing these left rural problems, which I wouldn't underestimate.
Well, I, for one, would love to learn more about how that's going to function, but we have time for one more question or comment and then discussion over coffee break.
Hüseyin Beyazıt
Please introduce.
from Istanbul.
Istanbul.
During the course of Professor Christopher Yu's speech, I really recognize very interesting point in terms of the paradigm, means basic views and assumptions about the way we perceive the reality in that context, media and telecommunication and entertainment industries. So, what I have read from the Professor Christopher Yu's is we need a paradigm shift. So, if you look at the regulatory and policy-making process, most of this mentality, even including in Europe, is based on telecommunication and information services as sort of still non-tradable good and limited resources. On the other hand, network economics, network externalities, and information economics tells us that this is not so. So, for example, who owns media? There is two prevailing theories. One of them is public choice theory. The other one is public interest theory. but they are still cannot be able to explain what really is. So, in short, that's what I have seen, and it has been really like in the industry since 1990s, and still see this paradigm is based on sort of like conventional Cold War type of thinking of seeing industry and the products, not only in the United States but also Europe. In that, what should be, since Thomas Kuhn says, if you want to change the paradigm, we have to change the basic assumptions. So, Christopher, could you tell me on that? Thank you so much.
So I actually read some of Kuhn's later writings, and he said he does agree with you in the long term, but he said conversion stories are rare, and you usually have to wait for the old generation to die before you get a real paradigm shift. So it's not easy to do. The paradigm shift I see that's interesting on the content side, which you're alluding to, is we see people moving from the idea of something that you need to protect inviolably into what they call now, they're talking about the permeability of intellectual property. So one of the things that we saw this happen in Spain, the content providers took a strong case against Google. They held that, they got the courts to acknowledge that skimming headlines was not fair use and barred them from doing it. The Spanish content providers thought they were going to get an influx of revenue from Google. What happened was Google simply stopped indexing their content because the business model didn't work. And what's interesting is what we now see is that, in fact, you do want people to use your content. You do want people to repost it, because not allowing that to happen cuts you off from the conversation completely. But you want to do it in a way which is going to allocate the benefits for the content these people have created in a different way. And that's really tying people up in knots, because they're used to thinking of intellectual property as something you defend. Now it's something you actually, it does Mercedes-Benz a world of good to be regarded as, why, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? Now, you can make an argument, is that a trademark violation? No one, I mean, but the point is you actually want to be part in a social networking world with your content as part of a global conversation. And that becomes much, much more complicated. And I don't know, there are a lot of, I do not see very encouraging signs from the people who hold the content of the ability to understand the need to, it's uneven across the industry about how they need to make that shift. David did ask me one question. I want to answer it. You talked about the standard setting proposal by Vint and Dave and others. So originally, most of the standard setting organizations took the position that no patented technology could go in. And that's a requisite for OSS, open source solutions. One problem is they backed off it. Why? There's a lot of good technology in there. And what they discovered is if you take that position, none of that can ever go into a standard. And the second thing that, and the solve to this is something that Milo has alluded to, which is we actually have generally multiple standard setting organizations all vying for viability and trying to hold up alternative standards. So there actually is some protection here. I'm not saying it's perfect. The one thing that worries me is the analog you said is that OSS is the only way you do security. One of the criticisms of the Android platform is that its OSS nature makes it a cesspool of malware. Because because it's based on Linux, you can't make people update their software. They can't make them put in security patches. You can't, I mean, the OSS nature, open source is sort of gives and takes away from a security standpoint. And the fact that there is no centralized control over the entire apparatus means that, in fact, many app stores in open source worlds are heavily criticized because there is no validation function, testing function to make sure that these things are actually doing what they say they're going to be.
Okay, we have to cut it now. Discussion more over coffee and maybe at the end of the day. And thank you to the panelists and to the questioners.